Mwaswera Bwanji, a very warm welcome to Trailblazer series, a space where young people meet to discuss important and pressing issues in the environmental space. So, moving into today's topic, have you ever wondered why some good findings and recommendations from research never get to be used? It all comes down to communication. How we communicate science to the public really matters. Today, we host Dr. Samantha, who is an expert when it comes to simplifying science into simple language. Sam has hosted lots of talks on this platform, and those of us who have seen her host would agree with me that she is a stage beast. Girl knows how to host. So, Samantha, it's really an honor to have you as a speaker today, and the screen is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And hey, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction once again, Sela. It's such an honor to be here tonight and to be able to speak with you about this important topic of communication within the conservation space. So the title of my talk is Science Informs Us, but Stories Move Us. Communicating research through storytelling and conservation. And this is important because oftentimes we take communication for granted. It's a tool we use often, but we sort of undermine its impact and how much of a tool it actually we actually use or it actually plays in our daily lives. And specifically speaking in the field of conservation, there's so many aspects of it that impact the way in which people understand us, the way in which we engage with people, and the way we communicate stories through research, through media, social media, traditional media, etc. And I just want to dive into that from a social research perspective, giving you a bit of insight into my own research over the years and what informed this talk today. So, so my research background really is from the University of Cape Town, where I did my undergrad all the way through to masters. I have a master's in development studies, and in that process, I was taught research intensely. UCT is a space where they really push you into the deep end, and you really have to sort of sink or swim. Most people swim, but it's out of a lot of skills development and really understanding what research is about. And through that research, we learned a lot about communication, but not in the way that people in the business sector or the private sector learn about corporate communication or interpersonal communication. It was communicating through our academic research, our academic work. And when I progressed to my PhD, which I did at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, I then learned how to use my own voice in my research, which is an important aspect of doing research and on communication. How do you speak? What kind of language are you using? What are your perspectives? And we'll delve deeper into that as we go along. So why is communication important? The environmental sector specifically has various stakeholders like any other sector, and participants from various contexts utilizing different languages, tones, representing different interests and backgrounds and social standings. And these impact different sectors of society. And these groups or people include policymakers, academics, communities, and the private sector, which include the NGOs, donors, philanthropists, etc. And this is a culmination of different actors, different modes and mediums of communication, such as social media that you see on the screen, Zoom, a platform like this one, podcasts, traditional media like radio, TV, as well as just ordinary forms of communication. So just speaking to people, sharing ideas, also nonverbal communication through our body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, etc. And I found this to be very interesting when I was preparing for this presentation, how easy it is to communicate, but also how difficult it is at the same time. So why is this an important topic? Why are we here today, basically? These key terms, communication, storytelling, and conservation, create the framework from which we will be discussing communication and conservation through storytelling. So communication builds connections, and it's a way to share and receive information from others. So like what Scylla did by introducing us today, that's communication. It is a process and a behavior. So all of us have different behaviors of communication. Some of us are introverts, extroverts, and we communicate through those through those lenses or types of characteristics. It also requires feedback. So if I say something to you, oftentimes you will respond. So there's a feedback loop within communication. And communication is also dynamic, it's transactional, and it creates meaning that is functional. So there's always a function to communication, meaning there's always a purpose behind what you're communicating. And this happens in relationships, social media, traditional media such as radio, TV, which I mentioned, and in our day to day lives. If you're in a relationship, you know, studies show that a lot of relationships fail because of failure to communicate. You're asking your partner, "What do you want for dinner?" and they're hearing something else. It's one of those aspects about communication. Um, that we often take for granted, but it affects our daily lives, even to the point of relationships or at the relationship level. And so communication creates meaning between two or more people. It's an interactive process of meaning making and meaning shaping where we share insights. It's functional, it is intentional or unintentional. And that comes to the nonverbal versus verbal communication, which is not always um, it's not always direct, but it comes off through, for example, like I said before, body language, like our emotions that we unintentionally show through, maybe if we're angry, our body stiffens up or our facial expressions tighten, etc. And so storytelling is a function of communication, where it's particularly recognized within the field of conservation through Indigenous peoples' engagement processes, through oral histories and by cultural conservation efforts. And what do I mean by that? It means there's an intersection of participation or engagement between different modes of knowledge. So let's say, for example, oral history, telling of our past histories through stories that we're using by mouth, traditional methods, and things like that, or factors like that. Um, and it's the art of using words and experiences and actions to reveal the elements and images of stories through our own experiences while encouraging the listener's imagination. And this was not coined, sorry, but described by Fernandez and Ramirez in their article around indigenous people storytelling. And storytelling amongst or within the indigenous peoples groups helps to forge numerous processes, such as entertaining, passing down a repertoire of culturally built knowledge, maintaining a sense of community, and instilling moral values within the community, all which lay the groundwork for social collaboration. So you can see there's an importance that storytelling plays within the function as a function of communication. And so it helps us recognize worldviews from experience or from the teller's perspective, fosters a sense of place through experiential knowledge, and it promotes dialogue for co-production of knowledge. And lastly, conservation, because not all of us in this space are conservationists. I just thought it would be important just to define what is conservation. Conservation is a widely defined scientific study of nature's and Earth's biodiversity with the purpose to protect species and ecosystems from extinction or erosion. And this was described by Ramutsindela et al., but a lot of other people have described conservation in various ways. This is just one of the most generic ways. And critical conservation scholars describe it as biodiversity protection, and they view it as an exclusionary principle or practice, advocating for the pristine, untouched wilderness that avoids human influence, thereby negating the processes communities or indigenous peoples played in the landscapes. And this created protected areas under the British fortress conservation model, where it was established as a colonial project in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1890s, perpetuating this narrative of a significance of the aesthetic value of nature. So to say that nature is supposed to be pristine and untouched, an untouched wilderness of flowing savannas with no people. Basically, that's what it means. Whilst natives and indigenous peoples or local communities were seen as incapable stewards of nature, and they were not effective enough, or their practices were not effective enough to carefully or sustainably govern those natural resources. So this is the history of conservation. I thought it was important for me to give that to uh, as we begin. So what makes a strong story? So every data-driven paper has these six essential elements working together, and I've chosen these six not to say they're the only ones. There are obviously more, which you can also write in the chat if you'd like. But I chose these six because they speak more to what I'm talking about today. Number one, the audience. Who are you? Who are you talking to? Who's your audience? What is the problem that you're trying to tackle? What is the context of that problem? So context can be personal context, like what are your personal biases or stereotypes that you carry about the topic? And context also speaks to um, what's the historical landscape or understanding of the area in which you're talking about. The argument, what are you arguing? Based on all of this, what are you arguing? What is your premise of your paper? What is also the lens in which you're using? So lens usually speaks to the theoretical models or contextual models that you're using in order to speak to that issue. And lastly, are you passionate or interested in this topic? And this is an important aspect for me because passion and interest often drives the research or the way in which you communicate your story. Without passion and interest, it's difficult to convince anyone, especially in storytelling. And you'll see why. So, why does this all matter? Why are we here? Why are we talking about communication and conservation? Because, you know, more data does not equal more action. In many conservation spaces, we assume that if people understand the science, they will act, which is often not the case. They may understand the science and maybe understand you a little bit, but how you've communicated will affect the way in which they take in that information and what they'll do about it. But understanding alone rarely leads to any behavioral change. We are not short of data, we are not short of information or reports, yet the gap between what we know and what we do remains really wide. So, despite unprecedented efforts and access to environmental data, reports, articles, books, you name it, we have it. Biodiversity continues to decline. Information alone doesn't drive the behavioral and policy changes that we need, unfortunately. More importantly, more reports does not mean more change. So, scientific reports are piling up as ecosystems collapse. And the gap between knowledge and action reveal the fundamental communication challenge within the conservation area. So using personal narratives to create empathy and emotional bonds between audiences is essential for conservation because it helps people understand the lived experiences of these areas, of these peoples, and the story behind it, which creates an emotional response. Because when people feel personally connected to the story through the way you're communicating, especially around conservation issues or in issues within the environmental sector, they become motivated to take meaningful action and create change. So scientific data is an abstract, is abstract in its nature. Scientific concepts feel removed from everyday experience. You can have graphs, you can have numbers, but it doesn't mean it will connect with people. It's often very technical. Some of these reports, especially from the UN, are like 100 pages long and they're very technical. The normal person who has a 9 to 5 will not be able to read through those 100 pages and understand what's going on in biospheres or what's going on with a certain community or whatever projects they're looking at. But sometimes the language is not it doesn't communicate to the wider audience. It takes more for people to understand what's being said, and it's emotionally distant. It doesn't connect the reader to what's actually happening on the ground oftentimes, because these reports, the journal articles, they have a certain rubric they have to follow in order to be published. So oftentimes you miss the personal narratives of the story because of the way in which the publishers require the writers to write. So how then do we transform data into stories that inspire conservation action. So I wanted to tell the stories from my conservation journey. And I put this picture of the airport because this is my favorite depiction of any journey. I mean, I like driving, but I like flying more. The airport. You meet so many people, you're traveling, and there's so many stories to be told in these spaces. For me, it's like heaven. Like really. I love flying. So this for me depicted the perfect way to say my conservation journey, which started in 2016 when I was doing my master's research, fieldwork research, where my supervisor at the time, literally, he pushed me into the deep end. He was like, Sam, you have to do field-based research, meaning you have to go into the field and stay with the communities you're going to be speaking about. And at the time, I was like, how many people actually do that? I mean, come on. But, he was right because he was saying that participant observation and staying within the community allows you to see how their daily realities actually are, as opposed to visiting every now and again. There's certain nuances you miss when you're not there. The lived experience of those people have to be shown by you actually being present on a daily basis. And I took his advice and I was like, okay, you know what? Let me do it. So my master's thesis was titled Militarized Conservation in the Kruger National Park: The Impact on Neighboring Communities. And it was based in the Kruger National Park, where I was looking at it from a lens of political ecology, from the lens of communities with conservation, and how the history of conservation, especially around the colonial history and South Africa's apartheid history, affected communities, especially those who live against this iconic landmark, the Kruger National Park. Because as I mentioned before, conservation, at least as a concept and a practice within Southern Africa, had as a colonial legacy, politically, socially, and ecologically. And so this was at the time, a very relevant topic because there, there was an increase in rhino poaching during the time. And it had started increasing from 2010, um, in hindsight now, to about 2018. But at the time, was I think at the peak of rhino poaching, and there were a lot of stories coming out of the media through Facebook, magazine articles, and even in traditional media through the radio and TV about what's going on in the Kruger there. And there was a lot of talk about heroes versus the villains, poachers versus, the people who are the anti-poachers, the soldiers, the military. And Kruger National Park became a militarized zone. So militarized zone means they take up aspects of the military to secure the area. So it could be the use of military apparel, training the rangers like the military. So the use of violent weapons like you see here under rocking for rhinos, the use of military tactics, um, training, and etc., which made it obviously a militarized zone. And this affected the way in which communities interacted with the national park, where now, even in the traditional media, because of the narratives that were being pushed, that communities were killing the rhino, there were campaigns like Rocking for Rhinos. This is an example that showed community members, or Black Africans to be specific, as the villains, and images that are very symbolic and violent, like the one with the rhino cutting off the nose of that man and being lynched there at the back, were coming out. And this was very distressing, not only as an African, but also just someone who existed within the South African landscape, within the communities, to understand that this was the narrative that was being pushed, that was influencing or fueling the response to rhino poaching, which was a militarized response. So it was justifying violence, basically, and dehumanizing the poacher by comparing them to terrorists and objects. So terrorists, because it became a security issue. Sorry, a national security issue. And then there was, again, heroes, villains, and also the narrative of hunter versus poacher. And oftentimes the poacher was a Black African person. And at the time, the Kruger, and there are many reports to show this, the Kruger was a place where it was like an untouched zone where people would go missing. And if you were seen near the fence at the time, there was a shoot to kill policy because they assumed you were scouting for rhino, and which wasn't always the case. And these are accounts that I heard from the communities I stayed with. I stayed with two communities during my master's thesis, and I got a lot of feedback about it. But my main finding, which I'll share with you now because of time, is where did our nature go? The communities themselves were far removed from nature and from the conservation space, the Kruger National Park, which they once lived in historically, which they were forcefully removed during apartheid to create this national park, to create game reserves within this area. As you can see on the left of your screen, they're private game reserves, and then there's the Kruger National Park, which is in darker green. The private game reserves were actually farms. There were farms that were then turned into game reserves. And between the farms or the game reserves and the national park, there's no fence. And so if the animals cross into the game reserves, it's called the animal belongs to the private owner of that game reserve. It's called the Game Theft Act, which allows for that. But for communities on the other side of the fence, they didn't have that access to the park. They didn't have that ownership to the animals because they didn't experience the park the way tourists or hunters or people who wanted to just see the animals could, because they did because of number one, it's not expensive, but it's difficult to enter without a vehicle. For example, and there's like they obviously it's wild animals, so you have to be safe. So there's a lot of aspects to why people didn't visit the park, which I can't go into, unfortunately, in much detail. But as you can see here, it actually went to the president's office, and he turned it into a national security issue, and that also created the response that you were seeing. So the stories that the people told me, the narratives that they shared, obviously were very disheartening. There were sensitive issues about human rights violations. Um, you know, yeah, it was a touching time, but it was quite interesting for me to learn about these issues and then to have the privilege to publish them. Where I published the accounts in my book, well, not in my book, sorry, in this book. It's a chapter of a book. Uh, and I used that quote, "Where did our nature go?" And it's because my supervisor and I were able to turn their narratives into a story that was publishable. And that was because we were able to show who the audience was. So at the time, obviously, because it was my master's thesis, the audience was academic. The problem was community exclusion. The context was the African Kruger National communities. Um, the argument was that anti-poaching does not work without the communities being involved. The community engagement aspect had to involve had to be involved in the anti-poaching efforts for anything to work regarding rhino poaching. The lens was political ecology. I'm not going to go into political ecology, but it's basically around understanding through a lens of social science, the political, social, and ecological nature of the problems. It's like a lens and it's multi-layered. I wish I could have gone through it. Oh, I love this topic. Anyway, passion and interest 100% because I love communities. I love working with people and I love the bush. Guys, if you haven't been to the bush, you have not lived. I mean, what are you doing? Like, cities are not it. You have to be in the bush. And living with the communities was such like, it was an experience that allowed me to grow as a person, but also as a researcher. And it grew my interest within the conservation area and space. And I have my supervisor to thank for that. So it was helping me learn how to turn science into story, at least for my master's, that was where I took the data, gave it meaning from the narratives that were given to me by my participants, and into action by publishing. So writing my thesis first and foremost, and then publishing with recommendations from the communities about education and awareness within the communities about conservation, traditional knowledge, being used as an anchor to stop anti-poaching as opposed to violent or aggressive responses, employment and wealth creation within the communities, because these are very impoverished spaces that don't have access to basic services such as water or roads. Well, that was at the time. But the last time I was there, they were still facing those problems, and that was in 2022. Um, and also the systemic engagement of all communities. For example, what they did with Makuleke, which is a very good example of community conservation. So I'm just trying to tell you that science informs us, but stories move us. And stories like those of the communities of Kruger National Park moved a lot of readers, at least the time I published, which was in 2021. And the second story I wanted to tell you about is the Zurich Zoo. So the Zurich Zoo is an interesting story because I have a friend at the time. So the Zurich Zoo is located in Switzerland. My apologies. I used to live in Switzerland. That's where I did my PhD. And one of my friends, who's Zimbabwean, went to the Zurich Zoo with his kids when they opened just after COVID. And they had the Leo exhibition open for the first time. And when he got there, he sent me a video of the exhibit. And immediately I asked him, "Where are you? I thought, have you gone home?" And he's like, "No, I'm in the zoo." I was like, "Hey, Bo, what are you doing in the zoo?" Wait, you're in the zoo. So I was confused because I was like, what? What's a school doing in the zoo? Like, what's going on? So you're probably thinking, oh, Sam, it's a school. Like, what's wrong? So the Lewa Conservancy, just a bit of background, is located in Kenya. And this exhibition opened in July of 2020. So the first critique of this was that the zoo represented the Lewa community in a way that resembled human zoos that were located in Europe and the West historically. So, for example, the photo here at the bottom, King Leopold II had a colonial section in his zoo in Tourveren in Brussels, in Belgium, where he had Congolese population he forcefully brought the Congolese population to the zoo to create a public exhibit of this community, of this Black community, like animals in a zoo. And and a lot of them lost their lives because they were not used to the weather, the climate, etc. And they were isolated from their environment and all of that. And another one here is from Brussels, Belgium. It's again, this is a human zoo. And this is in 1958. So the one part that really surprised me was this, which was barbershop or salon that had caricatures of African men and women. And this was located in a zoo with no explanation. So initially, we didn't even want to publish about it. We approached the zoo just to ask them, okay, what was your motivation or what are you trying to communicate? And they couldn't give us a clear answer. And even after we tried to engage with them and they refused to engage with us. So we're like, my supervisor then was like, let's publish. So that's what we did. So we critiqued the zoo's approach to representation of the people of the Lewa community, and because they named it the Lewa Conservancy, and we critiqued it based off of the historical legacy of human zoos, the colonial ties to conservation, which I spoke about earlier, and how they represented these African communities with this degradation narrative to say that these communities were poaching, they were misusing the environment because of grazing, etc., etc. And we wrote four, there's one upcoming articles on this. And it was published because we were able to tell the story of from a research, obviously a researcher's perspective, but querying how African people were being represented within the zooscape, given the human zoo's legacy. And through that communication, we were able to engage with WAZA, which is the World Association for Zoos and Aquariums, who then published our work in their magazines in 2023 and in 2024. And this was a great experience because we were able to tell the story of what was happening in Switzerland. And they responded with a great attitude for collaboration, and we gave key recommendations about decolonizing institutions and decolonizing exhibits, such as that one. And we were able to engage with zoos from around the world, including Auckland Zoo and Zoos Australia, where Zoos Australia even took our article as a strategic framework to implement decolonial thought within the zoo themselves. And we were able to engage with Auckland Zoo, who are already incorporating Indigenous knowledge within their framework and storytelling. As you can see, these are pictures from Auckland Zoo. As you can see, their language, the local language, is infiltrated. It's implemented within the zoo signage, within the zoo language, and they use traditional knowledge to communicate conservation within the zoo, because zoos in themselves are also research institutions as much as they are there for the protection of endangered species. And so, what made this story strong? We used the audience of academic, policy, and the NGO space, and we were able to engage with Waza. We also used the context there of the European and African to critique and sort of argue against misrepresentation of African communities. Um, the lens again was of political ecology. My passion was here just trying to understand why there was an African community being represented in a zoo, given the history, and also the lack of sensitivity regarding that issue. And that brings me to the issue of ethical storytelling, where although we may be telling stories of, say, indigenous peoples or different types of people, or there's always the issue of ethics within storytelling, where ethics refers to a set of rules or principles that are adhered to by society or an individual, and in this case, within our research, where we honor the voices and communities whose stories we are sharing. Authentic storytelling represents and respects diverse perspectives and avoids exploitation. So we have to be accurate, dignified, and respectful of the stories and the people who are telling them. We have to seek consent, prior consent and approval before we engaging with these communities, and respecting their traditional beliefs and the local authorities that uphold them. Also integrating knowledge systems. So before I spoke about communication through indigenous people's language, that biocultural interaction. So it's recognizing, representing, and respecting traditional indigenous knowledge systems. And so the question I ask to you today is, what story are you telling? Ask yourself, are these 6 essential elements working together in my story? So who's your audience? Who are you communicating with? What beliefs and stereotypes inform your perspective? Is your problem clearly defined? What are you trying to communicate through your argument? What lens are you using? Is it historical, contextual? And lastly, do you enjoy the subject area? But I can tell you, if you don't enjoy the subject area, it makes it very difficult to convince anyone. Passion is so important within storytelling. And your call to action, my call to action for you today is share your story. What is the one key insight from your experience or your work that could become a powerful story? That's the question I'm asking you today, and that's the call to action that I have for you. Because conservation is not just a science problem; it's a communication problem. What are we communicating? To whom are we communicating? And how are we communicating? Storytelling is a very powerful method, and I'm so glad I was able to share it with you today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Samantha. Right now, I'm thinking about the aspect of my life that I can be able to share with others and it can make a difference in others. That's the assignment that you've given me. Like, yeah, I'm so touched. And one thing that has really touched me from this talk is how the right presentation of the community is very important. When we're working with the community, how do we present the community? It's very important. And yeah, I love the way you linked it to indigenous knowledge. That will make them to feel involved, to feel ownership, and to want to get involved. You know, conservation is all about people. If they're not involved, then we can't succeed. But if they're involved, it's about them. Make them know that it's about them. So thank you so much, Samantha. I really enjoyed your talk, and I've wrote down the 6 points: the audience, the context that makes the story strong. I was about to say the strong story, but yeah, makes the story strong. I've written them down, and I'm going to use them. We are all different when it comes to communication. And now with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Diane, who is very good when it comes to interviews and everything. And yeah, I will let her handle the Q&A session. Diane, over to you.
But thank you so much, Sela. And thank you so much for a very insightful presentation. From your experience, what do you think makes an actual story that can move people to action? Is it how they understand, or is it how you write in terms of trying to grab the emotions? Is it the data that you have to highlight? I think at some point, probably even the community, until they understand why you need to conserve, probably the data might not even be relevant to them. So as a beginner, how do you get to put the story together that can relate or resonate to the community mainly before you bring it to a broader audience? How do you get even to frame that message, that story about the conservation of what is happening on ground?
That's such a good question. Thank you so much for that. So I think number one, when you said communities, it's always important to identify who your audience is because that impacts the language you use for communication and also the medium you use for communication. Oftentimes, the communities that work within the conservation space, especially in the African context, live within the rural setting. So if they're in rural areas, they may not have access to laptops, electricity, internet, um, in those mediums of engagement. So you have to be cognizant that if you write an article, are they going to be able to print it and actually hold it and read it? Um, and if they are, great, then you can do it that way. But if they aren't, what other methods can you use to communicate with them? And if once you identify your audience, then you can now, create a strategy like how am I going to communicate with them? And with communities, at least the ones that I've worked with, the the best form of communication is often speaking face to face when you're together to explain the problem in a language that they understand, usually a local language. And if you're using English, have a translator, and understand the local context enough to also understand the hierarchy that exists within these spaces so that you don't step on any toes, as well as you can communicate in a way that is respectful and also understanding. And in some spaces, men are the only ones allowed within these spaces where there's like a public gathering. And if there are any women, they're not allowed to speak as freely as men. So if you understand those cultural nuances, you can also maybe create time to speak to the women on their own so that you can also get their perspectives because there's a gender dynamic to to communication or to storytelling, actually to research, really, to doing the research. So I think once you understand those, that number one, who your audience is, it helps. Also, personal biases. So your personal context is important because we all come with certain biases about whatever it is. And I think having some self awareness or self reflection is important because you have to be able to understand where your strengths lie and where your limits are. So I think where you see your limits are, it makes it easier for you to see, okay, maybe I need to change certain things about the way I'm engaging and the way I'm speaking. Um, Especially, I think for me, communicating, okay, maybe it's becoming too long winded, but lastly, communicating in spaces that are like policy or decision making spaces, like on the global level. I once went for the IUCN World Conservation Congress. In that space, you have to put on a completely different, if I can say it that way. Your English has to be on point. You have to use technical language. You have to understand the is it the abbreviations or the acronyms? Like they use a lot of acronyms. They'll say BCC, WCC, and you need to know all of them because no one will stop and say, "Oh, this is what it means." And you. I think you just have to think on your toes so that you're able to communicate. You're able to converse with people at different levels, and confidence is a must because some people are, they're directors, or heads of departments, and you shouldn't be shy. You must just be able to speak, obviously with respect, and yeah, and own your space. I hope I answered your question. I don't want to take too long.
Yes, 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 Samad, and I would agree with you. Confidence has to be a key. And one thing we know about you, Dr. Samantha, is how you own the room, take the ownership, and lead the list. And thank you so much for a great response. And Tendaisha Chitima, if you're okay, would you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
So thank you so much. No, I was trying to unmute, but then I think the host needed to allow me to unmute. I won't be able to switch on my video, but thank you so much, Dr. Samantha Sitole, for such an amazing presentation. It's so good to see you in your professional element because I know you from elsewhere. Okay, so my question is around, so I'm an actress, I'm in the film space, and I'm interested in conservation storytelling. And so this is why I saw Samantha post on her status about these series of lectures I want, or whatever you want to call these. And I was like, definitely I'm going to be watching. So this is the second time I'm joining. But I'm really interested in what Sam thinks, or Dr. Samantha thinks about how media such as film, TV, radio, other immersive and social media in the arts in general can be catalysts for action in the conservation space, because that's the space I work in. And yeah, I'm just curious to know what you'll think about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tendai. And it's so good to hear from you. Yeah, Tendai and I go way back. She's an actress. She's acted in Hollywood movies. But yeah, okay, I'll just leave it there. But she's very talented. So thank you for your question. Um, so what I think immersive media and social media is a very important tool for communicating within the conservation space. Because outside of the writing and storytelling in this way, more people are focused on what's on social media, and social media has a way to capture the attention of people quickly with the short clips, with the music, with the way in which social media is now. Um, and so does TV and radio in different ways. But social media specifically has the ability through movement, through voices, through even short clips to capture the stories of these spaces, especially say on species protection. Just I think bringing attention to different landscapes. Probably there's degradation. There needs to be some type of crowdfunding. There needs to be some type of attention, especially in the context I'm in currently in our, we have a wetland management issue where the wetlands are being destroyed at a rate that they cannot replenish themselves. And through social media, some people have been able to show the extent to which there's damage within the wetlands within Zimbabwe. And also now they're using traditional media such as TV and radio to bring awareness in various languages like Ndebele and Shona to people so that they understand, okay, wetlands are not just empty or dead spaces. They're actually biodiversity rich spaces that replenish our water supply. And I think it's so important, especially traditional media, that's often now forgotten because I guess people don't watch TV or listen to the radio as much. But people in spaces like communities still listen to the radio. And through radio, you're able to penetrate various groups of people that would not otherwise have internet to be able to go on social media. And so it's very important the type of messaging that is put on these platforms to reach these people and tell them what the issues are and speak to them in a way that they can understand and appreciate whatever the problem is. Where there's so many environmental problems, some of which may not relate to them. But then the ones that do, they'll be able to capture if these mediums are used in whatever context that is. So this is a great question because I think it could actually be a talk on its own, social media and traditional media, because there's so many ways in which one could communicate, but it's such an important tool, especially as you can see now how social media is being used for good and bad things. Yeah, but thank you so much for your question tonight.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Samantha. And allow me now to take you to the point of data versus action. I know one of the powerful points that you have raised is that data does not always lead to the action. And I'm wondering, why do you think there's a gap between the scientific knowledge and the real world change? And as a follow-up question, and how do you think as young conservation can begin to bridge the gap between? And I know in the room we have so many young people who are into the space of conservation. Leave a call to action for us as you answer to that question.
Thank you. Well, I think the call to action, I think, is definitely with what Tendai's question was around social media. And I think there's a gap because with scientific research, like I mentioned earlier, it's often very it's text heavy, it's information heavy, and sometimes if people are using statistics or numbers, it's difficult to interpret what it actually means unless you read the whole article. And sometimes we don't have that time, unfortunately. I think we're the microwave generation where we want things to be on the
That's right.
fingertips. So
Mhm.
yeah, so that's why social media is so important, because if you're able to turn that data or that science into a clip someone can listen to, or a graphic how do you say, a graphic video, it's like graphic facilitation where they draw the video and there's someone narrating, or you can podcasting these days. There are different mediums you can use, but I think it's important, I think, to bridge that gap, to jump from science as the data heavy aspect that it is, to something that's more palpable for the broader audience, especially if you want to reach people who are not academics. People who are academics were forced to read these things because we need to either write a paper, speak on it, or something. But other people will not. Like the UN reports I mentioned, most people don't read them, but the information in there is so important, especially for our environment. But if the UN, and I'm not sure if they do this, but if they hired someone who, had that tech savvy storytelling angle and said, okay, can you make this 120-page report into a 10-minute video? I think they would get further. And I'm not saying they're not doing that now, but I haven't actually searched for that, so I'm not sure. But I think so. Young people have that. The call to action would be use the spaces that you have and the tools that you have. We all have a cell phone, and I'm sure we can record ourselves speaking. And just because you haven't published doesn't mean you don't have a story to tell. I was just fortunate because my supervisors pushed me to publish. That's why I'm published now. But before that, I mean, there are different ways in which you can communicate with the people in your spheres of influence, like your family, your friends. And then if you want to go further than that, grab your phone, create a video, or create an audio, something. And there's this new platform called Substack, where if you don't want to publish in a journal, which costs a lot of money, by the way, it's so expensive to publish in journals. But if you don't want to or can't afford to publish in a journal, there's Substack or platforms like Substack that allow you to write your personal stories or whatever it is, that your opinion pieces, and you can publish them and you can share them with whoever you want, and people can read them. So I think that's a great platform for young people like us. Maybe you're not financially there yet. One day you will be, or you're not part of an institution. That's a way to start publishing or to start sharing your story.
Now, I have another question in the chat box from Masai Chulu Kataya.
Yeah, I was trying to find out. Thanks for the good presentation. Basically, I was looking into the context of wildlife conservation background, especially in many countries in Africa. How can you design a storytelling in order to convince the community to participate in conservation? And again, how can you use the storytelling in environmental education as an
Thank you.
educator?
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for this question. This is a very good question. I don't think there's one way to convince a community to participate in conservation. I think even the word convince may be difficult. I think there needs to be a co-production of knowledge when you enter the space, meaning that you are learning and they are also learning from you, and you're co-creating the knowledge together. In that way, there's no winner or loser or someone having to take down knowledge or bring it up. You're both in a space of learning. So it's a horizontal, it's a horizontal there can't be a hierarchy if it's horizontal, but it's a horizontal learning process. So where it's a systematic approach to entering the community and asking them, number one, what problems do you guys have, or what problems are you facing with the environment? What do you think conservation is? Do you even call it conservation? Oftentimes in our local languages or indigenous languages, we don't even call it conservation. It has a different meaning, shape, size, and they've been practicing conservation even though they don't call it that, but in a different way, in a way that has not been recognized by science. And that's why traditional knowledge is so important. Because, for example, in Zimbabwe, we have totems, and I think totems are, I don't know if it's across Africa, but we have totems. And you'll notice that people who have let's say it's, the person's totem is an eland or a lion or an elephant, they respect that animal to the point of conserving it because it's their totem. And the totems go as far as someone identifying with that animal or with that object from nature. And actually, to the point that people greet and call you that totem. So there's sort of an identification and ownership of that animal or that aspect of nature that then comes with the conservation of that animal. So I wouldn't say convince the communities, but I would say let's co-create that with them. Let's actually come and learn from the community. Because when we come in as an empty plate or an empty slate, there's more they can show us than we could ever show them, especially if we're coming in with a project. Often projects come defined with a defined budget, like we want these outcomes, etc., etc. But normally it won't work if the community is not on board. The project will not be sustainable. Number one, is the conservation problem actually a problem for them? If, like in the case of Kruger, rhino poaching was not necessarily a problem for the community. They were worried about water. They wanted fresh water. So if you come saying about rhino poaching, they'll be like, yeah, but we don't have water. So you see, there's already a mismatch in expectations. And if you come in with a project budget saying the community will benefit, let's say 20,000 from this project, they might actually just follow that project for the money for the duration, and then you lose the engagement soon after that, because the engagement was not out of a need or a necessity. It was just out of the needs of that project. Stella is actually an environmental educator who uses storytelling in her work, so I don't want to step up off of what she does, but I'll try my best because I'm not an educator in the schooling system myself. But storytelling is a great way, especially through pictures, through diagrams, through toys, through games, music. That way you interact with children, because if once you tell the story in the game or in the song or with the pictures, kids catch it faster. And storytelling is so important because kids remember images, kids remember the story. I remember as growing up, we used to hear the story of Tsuro Nagudo, which is Tsuro is what, a rabbit and the baboon. I don't even know the I can't remember what actually the story was, but I think the baboon was the naughty one. But because it came with a song and it came with a context, and they told a story. I remember these stories, maybe not in detail, but I remember them. And I think Stella can correct me if I'm wrong, but kids really capture the essence of your message through fun, through games, through I think interactive learning. And I think it's a very important aspect within educating children. Storytelling is, I think, one of the best, especially when you're trying to teach them concepts in the environmental sector. Thank you, Stella. So okay, I was on point. Thank you, Stella.
I really love how Samantha had put it. And yeah, one thing that I might add is for environmental education, I would encourage that it comes from them rather than you telling them, you know. So you can just plant something, but let them discover it themselves. You don't have to tell, oh, we are doing this because we want you to learn this. No, just do the thing with them and let them discover it themselves. That way, kids really learn, you know. I'm thinking of an example that I can give when it comes to that. Yo. Now the example is
Oh,
not coming, but yeah, the most important thing is it should be learner centered. Learner centered. You should do all the activities, all the games, but it should be learner centered. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Thank you, Stella. And now let me welcome a question from Annette Mutoni.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Annette. Thank you, Dr. Samantha. I really appreciate your presentation. It was very interesting and very amazing. I'm a student at AOU, but I also work there in different ways. So I really have I'm actually doing a research on human-wildlife conflict, and I was very like I heard that you guys you talked about the game theft term. I didn't hear it well, and like during your presentation, and I was like, why do you guys choose this term to be used, as it was the time where the animals were crossing from one place to another, and they were crossing to the human areas or the parts where there's a lot of people, something like that. And why do you guys choose that topic to be used during your research? And the second question, during that time, during that game theft thing, how are the challenges do you faced, and how did you manage them during your research? Thank you.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you so much for even having your video on. It's so good to see your beautiful face. Okay, the first part about the Game Theft Act. So it's an act that exists within the South African context, especially because so the Kruger National Park it's very big. It's, I think, the size of the country of Israel. And on the peripheries of the Kruger National Park, on the South African side, if you remember my map, there are private game reserves that run all the way down from the top to the bottom along in the South African side. And those private reserves used to belong to farmers who owned that land during apartheid. So before apartheid, local communities stayed within the breadth of Kruger National Park, and they were forcibly removed to create the national park. And once the national park was, or I think during the process of the creation, there were white farmers who settled there, who wanted to farm different plants and whatnot. But because it's such an arid area, they didn't yield much. So they started farming livestock, and because it's again arid, it didn't yield much. So they then changed it to game reserves to allow the free movement of wildlife. But between the private game reserves, which are owned by private individuals, and the national park, which is a public entity, there's no fence. So it allows animals to move in and out of these areas. And private game reserves function and benefit from this because the animals come in and out. So if you have tourists, they create watering holes, etc., so that the animals come in and you get more tourists, and the tourists happy, they can see the animals, etc. However, so that's why it's called the Game Theft Act, because once the animal is on your land, it now belongs to you. It's private property. So that's why it's called the Game Theft Act. Because once the animal comes onto your property, it belongs to you. However, the communities that exist outside of the game reserves, in between the national park and the game reserves, they do not have access to that privilege. They can see the animals through the fence, but they don't have access to owning the animals. And so that's where I was trying to show the discrepancy between communities and those who own land near the private game areas, or who are tourists within these areas. Because all the game reserves are also very expensive to stay in. They're very expensive. So local communities can't afford the rates or the prices. They can probably go for day visits, but not to stay and actually enjoy the wildlife the way a tourist would. And some of the challenges I faced was not necessarily with the Game Theft Act specifically, but I think was just accessing the spaces. Um, for instance, it's difficult to enter the game reserve. Well, it's not difficult to enter the game reserves, but to, I think, conduct research of this sensitive nature, it's not very. People don't really want to talk about militarization. I mean, at the time, it was a very hot topic. Like, no one wanted to talk about, even the communities, because they thought maybe I'm from Sandparks or I'm a cop or something. So it was a very delicate topic. So that was the difficult part, and also just for my safety. Um, I had to really stay within the communities. I didn't venture out or anything like that, because there was people were scared a little bit of moving around, especially after dark, in case there was an event or an issue that happened during that time. Yeah. Thank you for your question, Annette.
Thank you, Dr. Samantha, and thank you for a good point. You mentioned about involving the communities in ownership, but also even having access to those national parks. And it brought my thoughts about, if you look at the pricing for local residents even to visit the national parks, the prices are ridiculous. It's way expensive. Yeah. Not many do really earn even that amount. And I think if there could be a change around that even community can have access to visit and, engage them let them know why do we need even to conserve. Begin from there, something like that. But thank you. I think that is a wrong way to go. Now, as a last question, I have a last question from Johan Kruger, Director for Share Screen Africa. I know he dropped the question in the chat box, and I want to welcome him as we conclude our Q&A session and as he asks his question. Johan, if you're still with us, you're welcome.
Yeah, Sam, the context of my question is our last Unlocking Nature on this previous Thursday. We had a brilliant presentation two brilliant presentations. And the first presentation ended with the sentence that there is a way of engaging with communities that conservation almost becomes an incidental consequence. And I mean, this is in the context of human-lion conflict, which is, I'd say, about as conflicting as it can get. And then the second speaker, she portrayed a project that was that happened with the Laikipia community in Kenya, where she was involved intimately for 2.5 years to figure out how to create a solution for lions to exist sustainably with the community. And it took 2.5 years of a lot of lion losses and a lot of failures, if I can put it like that. And somebody said to me the next day, well, why? And eventually, after 2.5 years, there was a breakthrough conversation, and they devised a absolutely brilliant scheme where the communities are earning points for conserving lions and other wildlife. And it was a tangible reward, and it changed everything. And somebody said to me, why didn't she just have this conversation on day one? And I realized, but this is just not how it works. It does make sense that you should have that conversation. And so I was just wondering, in your experiences dealing with communities, how long does it take to build that sense of trust that you actually get to real solutions? Because it's, as you say, first of all, the lived experience and the co-creation of solutions. And yeah, what does that process look like to arrive at that point for that to actually happen?
That's a very good question. And thank you so much for that background. And thank you, Johan. It's a difficult question because communities are different and contexts are different. And within the context specifically of the Kruger, at the time it was very contentious between sandparks and the local communities because of, I think, how the conservation or the anti-poaching efforts for rhinos was going about. So there was a lot of mistrust, a lot of lack of social cohesion within the community, because it was purported that Parks was planting spies within the communities, like at the local beer halls, at church, to listen to conversations about, like, if you hear anything, like if you say the word poacher or rhino, like, if you say terrorist in the airport, you get flagged, like they can kick you out. Like, so it was sort of that sort of atmosphere. So it was very difficult for them to trust me. It took, I think I was there for almost 3 months. I think the first 2 weeks, people were just telling me, yeah, we like conservation. I'm asking them, but what is conservation to you? And they were just giving me very generic answers. And I was like, yay. So I told my supervisor, I was like, I think there's no rhino poaching problem here because everyone's saying the same thing. Then he's like, no, keep trying because they don't trust you yet. And I think once I started engaging in the community activities and they actually saw that, no, seriously, this is just a child who's doing her research and who really wants to understand what's going on, I think that's when they started to open up. And I think number one, authenticity. Be genuine about your interaction with them, especially if you're not from the area. Learn the language, number two. And also, you're able to communicate with them in the language that is easy for them, because English is not always easy for most people. Number three, for me, it took long, number one, because of the nature of the situation. But I think if it's not as contentious as what I was experiencing, I think if people see how genuine you are and how much you want to find a solution, finding a solution together might be the process that takes the longer time, not actually engaging with the community. And I've also experienced that it needs a lot of resources. So if you come bearing money, financial resources, it makes the process a little bit easier because they see the benefit of financial resources as opposed if you come empty-handed. Because you can help maybe with some of the problems that they do have, like sinking a borehole or helping with the computer lab, like donating a computer or something like that. And I came with nothing because I was a student. I only came with my goodwill and joy. So I mean, it was a very interesting process. I was just really, I think, I don't want to say lucky, but really to just be in those two communities where the people they were very nice and very forthcoming with the information after they started to trust me.
But we cannot leave the room, Samantha, without you giving us concluding remarks, as a takeaway that we should take from tonight. And yeah.
Oh, concluding remarks. Yeah, my concluding remarks are just, I think, be cognizant of the power that you carry with your own story. Be cognizant that the work that you're doing, the research that you're interested in and that you're doing can actually create a powerful story. It doesn't actually have to be the scientific data itself, but it can be the anchor to the broader story that you're trying to tell. Because oftentimes, I think people want to see data and facts and evidence that informs what you're saying. So it's important, obviously. But the way in which you tell your story, like Annette's story, the way you tell your story is so important because there's someone out there who will relate to what you're saying. And I think that's why everyone should just try and share your story with at least one or two people and see how they actually take it in. And it's not only in conservation, but just in life in general. The power of connection and emotional sharing through storytelling, it's so strong. And I think it's something that we take for granted oftentimes.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Samantha, for taking your time to share with us and to educate us more about conservation storytelling and the right way to frame it that speaks more to the community, to the audience.